Hola amigos, ¿qué tal? Sean ustedes bienvenidos a la entrevista. Hoy se encuentra con nosotros Fred McMahon. Él es vicepresidente del Fraser Institute, un instituto canadiense que se dedica a estudiar las consecuencias y los problemas que pueda tener la libertad económica y la falta de libertad económica. Fred McMahon es, como le decía a usted, vicepresidente de Investigación de Políticas Internacionales y director del Centro de Estudios para el Comercio y la Globalización en el Fraser Institute. Entre otros proyectos, él es coordinador de Libertad Económica en el Mundo y la Red de Libertad Económica, formada por institutos independientes de investigación en casi 70 países. Entre otras cosas, Fred McMahon coordina el proyecto que estudia la libertad económica en el mundo a través del Índice de Libertad Económica del Fraser Institute. Vamos a estar haciendo esta conversación en inglés para que usted pueda escuchar directamente al señor McMahon en sus palabras. Mr. McMahon, thank you very much for allowing me to speak with you.
It is a great pleasure to be here.
The Fraser Institute has been presenting its index of economic freedom in the world for how many years?
The project actually started in the mid-1980s and involved 3 Nobel laureates, 60 of the world's top scholars, trying to figure out exactly what economic freedom was and how to measure it. The first index came out in 1996, and we've produced one every year since.
Why is it important to measure economic freedom?
Well, first off, it's a moral question. You and I should be free to make our own economic decisions, not have them imposed on us by other people. So that's a moral question. It's a question of fairness, too. You and I know what we want, much better than an all-powerful government. And thirdly, and for many people, most importantly, it's the route to prosperity and poverty reduction. The drive and ingenuity of individuals and families beats government planning hands down every day of the week. And it's typically government that limits our economic freedom. When government's heavy hand is taken away from us, economic growth ensues, prosperity grows, poverty declines.
What are the countries in the world that presently enjoy more economic freedom?
Canada, the United States. So the United States has been slipping recently under both George Bush and Barack Obama. Hong Kong, Chile, New Zealand, to name a few.
Is there a reflection of the economic freedom on the prosperity of a nation?
Oh yeah, it's been measured many times. The prosperity of a place that has a high level of economic freedom is 3 to 4 times that of a place that lacks economic freedom. All you have to do is look around the world. I mean, the starkest example is, of course, North Korea, where there's no economic freedom, and South Korea, where there is some. The different trajectories of China under the communists, when there was no or very little economic freedom, and now where they have more economic freedom, but they were much surpassed by Taiwan. Take a look at this part of the world and see what's happened to Chile, which was once, basically just average income in Latin America, and it's skyrocketed.
It was poorer than Mexico in the 1970s,
yeah.
And it is now much richer than Mexico. What are the countries that have less economic freedom? You mentioned North Korea. What other countries are in this group?
Venezuela, right now, of course, Cuba, Zimbabwe, basically places where you wouldn't want to live.
Some countries, let's say Cuba and Venezuela, claim that maybe they've restricted economic freedoms, but that this provides more equality. What do you think?
It's not true at all. Inequality is actually increased in Venezuela under Chavez, and there is inequality in Cuba, perhaps less than in the United States, but the poor are extremely poor, and those associated with government, and this is where inequality can really manifest itself. Those associated with government have all sorts of privileges that even rich people in free market economies don't have.
It's remarkable to hear that Hong Kong has a high index, a high level of freedom, considering that it is part of the People's Republic of China. How can they manage to maintain that freedom? And has this helped to actually, maintain the development of Hong Kong. I remember Hong Kong in the 1950s was 3 times poorer than Mexico. Now it is maybe 4 or 5 times richer than Mexico.
Oh, Hong Kong in the 1950s was a disaster case. It had been basically leveled by the war. It had no natural resources. It had a hostile neighbor. Not only was it poorer than Mexico, it was poorer than most African nations. And what happened is the administration there just basically let people make their own economic choices. China is watching it very carefully. I was invited over to Hong Kong by the government there, and as the officials told me, busloads of people from the mainland show up every week trying to figure out what goes on in Hong Kong, why it works, how they can import that to the rest of China.
Is there a contradiction between economic freedom and political freedom?
The two are not the same thing. So you can have a high level of economic freedom in a place like Hong Kong or Singapore, both of which have fairly low levels of political freedom. Not low like Venezuela, but still fairly low. But when you look at history, nations, when they develop economic freedom, tend to set themselves on a path towards democracy. And that's because if you're dependent on government to feed and clothe your family, make a living, get a promotion, travel, you really don't have any, you're always worried about offending a government official, offending somebody who has power over your life, so you really don't have freedom when government controls the economy. When there's economic freedom and you make your own choices and government can't punish you economically, that's when democracy starts to develop. And you see that in any number of places. Taiwan and South Korea are good examples. When they launched on the path towards economic freedom and prosperity, both were brutal military dictatorships. Two of them were unpleasant places in the world. Now both have virtually first world democracy and first world freedoms. Hong Kong, if it hadn't been given back to the Chinese, would be a democracy by now.
Hong Kong and Singapore are very small countries, or in fact, in the case of Hong Kong, it's not even formally a country. But what about South Korea? What's the experience that we've seen in South Korea?
South Korea in the late 1950s and early 1960s decided to open up to the world, basically to allow the ingenuity and drive of their people to develop their own industries. And they developed, of course, some of the world's trend-setting industries. And that's basically what happens whenever you allow people their own economic freedom. One of the things that's very encouraging that's happening in Africa right now, which is growing well, partially because of minerals, but also governments are liberalizing there, and you see new enterprises growing up.
This is the first time we see growth in Africa since the 1950s, isn't it true?
Absolutely. In fact, throughout most of the 1960s and 70s, Africa was going backwards. Their standard of living was declining. They had huge socialist, gangster-type states that suppressed the freedom of their people. You couldn't set up a business. Law was unreliable. Still lots of problems, but liberating people a little bit powers a little bit of growth. That creates a greater demand for liberty, which powers a little bit of more growth.
What's happened with Mexico? I see your data, and I see that Mexico had almost no economic freedom in the 1970s, but there were some positive developments in the 1980s and 1990s. But we've actually begun to lose ground in comparison to other countries. What are we doing wrong in Mexico?
There are two things that I would very much point to, and one is just difficult, and the other is only politically difficult. I'll start with the politically difficult one, and that's your labor market. When we look at labor market freedom in Mexico, it's quite low. This has disastrous consequences for the overall economy. It means that people are excluded from the formal workforce. It means that you have a formal and informal sector, training, capital, education are very difficult in the informal sector. You're excluding people. That makes no sense. But that's often politically difficult because there are power centers that want the restrictions on the labor markets. The other thing, which is just plain difficult, is the rule of law. The rule of law is the central infrastructure of economic freedom and any other freedom, because without the rule of law, the rich and the powerful will take advantage and limit the economic freedom of the poor and the weak. And no one really knows how to build the rule of law other than work at it, work at it, and work at it.
Some people are amazed at finding out that rule of law is so important about freedom. One would imagine that freedom, in fact, actually would require you to be free of any restrictions that the law might impose on you. Why is it so important, the rule of law?
Because the rule of law is, well, you've heard the expression, the rule of law rather than the rule of man. That means that I actually know what the rules are and how to operate within them. And yes, the rules do limit my freedom, but if the rules are properly set up, they only limit my freedom when I'm using it to limit your freedom. On the other hand, without a rule of law, I don't know what the rules are, and the rules aren't set up to stop me from limiting your freedom. The rules are set up to privilege somebody else, the rich and the powerful.
Well, I lived in Mexico in the early 1990s, and I live in Mexico right now. But if I look at the ranking of Mexico in the 1990s, and 1990 in particular, we're doing much better than we're doing right now. And still, I don't think that, from what I can see around me, that economic freedom has, or any kind of freedom, has deteriorated in Mexico over the past 20 years. What's happened? Are you measuring differently, or is it that other countries have advanced and we haven't?
We're measuring the same. So the series goes back consistently. Other countries, yes, have increased their economic freedom. I must confess, I'm not a great expert on Mexico, so I'd have to spend more time looking at the data to give you specific answers over time. But as I say, in looking at today's data, two glaring examples are rule of law. The two glaring problems are rule of law and labor market restrictions.
It's interesting to see that Canada is doing so well in the rankings. When you go to the States, people tell you, well, Canada is just almost a socialist country. Is it true, or what's happening? How come Canada gets such good ratings?
Well, you know, it's kind of strange. I talk about shape-shifting politicians. The last Prime Minister, or the last long-term Prime Minister of Canada, was somebody who came from the left wing of a leftist party, the Liberal Party of Canada.
The Liberal Party, which is not necessarily liberal in the way we use the word in Mexico, at least.
No, exactly. It's not a neoliberal, it's not a classical liberal.
That's right, yeah.
Party. It's a party that believes in big government and government making decisions for you. But Jean Chrétien, a shape-shifting politician, cut the size of the Canadian government more radically than either Reagan or Thatcher did. Cut the right sort of...
Like Bill Clinton eliminating the budget deficit in the U.S.?
Yes, even more so.
Getting a surplus.
Yeah. So we were lucky, and it was good economic policy.
But in fact, what we've seen since Jean Chrétien's government in Canada is that Canada's actually had a pretty good rate of growth. Am I right?
Yes. In the 1980s, well, 70s, 80s, and much of the 90s, we were lagging. Our productivity growth was low. Our productivity growth still is not what it should be, but it's remarkable. When you take government out of the economy, you don't leave a void. You leave space for people to operate and create businesses and create prosperity. And that's exactly what happened in Canada. Jean Chrétien withdrew the government from large sections of the economy. It didn't go to waste. It flowered and grew.
What happened in a country like Ireland that was considered an example for many countries in the world, low tax rates, freedom to invest? What happened? How come they actually entered into such turbulence?
Well, I think that Ireland will come back, but you're quite right, and it was part of the financial crisis. A bubble in the property market, lack of information, in my view, to the people doing that. You do need appropriate regulation to ensure that I'm not gambling with your money. And this...
Financial regulation.
Yeah, yeah.
So you can actually have good financial regulation and you're not necessarily reducing the freedom of people.
If it's properly structured. I mean, unfortunately, an awful lot of financial regulation is just wasted paper, rules that increase costs, stuff that stops you from doing things. It's interesting, Canada did not have a financial crisis. Our regulation is actually lighter than the regulation in the United States. In fact, if you look across the board, there's very little relationship between the heaviness of the regulation, which is what people think is needed to control financial crisis. Very little relationship between that and who actually had a financial crisis. It's much more in how the regulation is structured, whether it works with the market, and whether it provides appropriate safeguards rather than being too restrictive.
What happened in Europe? What were the sins of Europe?
The countries that are now in the biggest trouble tend to have a similarity. The government got out of control. This was true in Greece, which was cooking its books, borrowed hugely, lack of appropriate accounting.
Italy was the same.
Italy.
Although one exception is Spain, which had a relatively small budget deficit, but still it had a real estate bubble.
Yeah. So you can either have an overly indebted private sector, or which is what happened in Ireland,
or in Spain,
or an overly indebted public sector, and these just create horrible imbalances.
How do you measure freedom in so many countries in the world? 144, if I remember correctly. How do you do it? What factors do you actually take into account, and how do you decide? Okay, Mexico has this grade and this factor, and this grade and this factor.
We only use third-party data. That means we produce none of the data originally ourselves. So we can't make a decision on Mexico's score because we take the data from someone else. We look at data in 5 separate areas: size of government. If government squeezes out the space for free exchange, limits economic freedom. Freedom to trade. You should be able to buy and sell from anybody in Mexico and from anybody in the world. Freedom, the rule of law, as we discussed before, sound money. Governments can inflate your property away.
Central banks.
Yes, exactly. And regulation and credit, labor, and business. So we put 42 separate variables in those 5 separate categories and equally weight them. There's no magic to equally weighting them. It's just there's no better way to do it. But all our data is available publicly. So if you decide, well, no, I'd rather weight this another way and look at it, you can do it. And that's how we put it together. Very objective, not creating our own data, using a very simple system.
So it's not a discretionary decision of an economist who says, okay, this country deserves an A+ and this country deserves a C-.
No, because there's too much bias when you do that.
Do you have a large group of people doing that, doing the rankings, doing the scores?
Because we collect the data from third-party sources, we've only 2 or 3 people collecting and sorting out the data.
Well, let's pause for a second at this point. Estamos en la entrevista. Estamos conversando con Fred McMahon, él es vicepresidente del Fraser Institute, el instituto que establece el índice de libertad económica en el mundo. Regresamos en un momento más. En la entrevista estamos conversando con Fred McMahon, él es vicepresidente del Fraser Institute y es el coordinador de la elaboración del índice de libertad económica en el mundo. Tell me a little bit about the Fraser Institute. How does it start and who funds it?
The Fraser Institute started in the mid-1970s when economic freedom was under attack in Canada. We don't take we don't accept any government money. We're funded entirely by foundations, which I think is 50% to 60% of our revenue, businesses and individuals, which make up the rest.
And what's the purpose? What is the purpose of the Fraser Institute only to fight for freedom? Is that the reason of being, the raison d'être?
Fundamentally, yes, to fight for freedom.
Has there been a change in attitude towards freedom in Canada and in other countries in the world because of the work of the Fraser Institute?
Well, we think so. And in fact, we can chase several policy changes in Canada back to our work, both at the provincial level and at the federal level. One provincial government, a left-wing government as a matter of fact, our NDP, which is our Socialist Party, publicly credited the Fraser Institute for reforms they made in their tax code to encourage growth. Our Economic Freedom Project has influence all around the world as well.
How long have you been in charge of the Economic Freedom Project?
I've been with the Fraser Institute for 10 years and managing the project for most of that time.
What's next? What's next? What comes next? I mean, you've been publishing this index of economic freedom for many years. It is a reference in many countries in the world, including Mexico. Is that enough, or do you want to do something else? I mean, the Fraser Institute.
We've expanded. We're looking at other things. We have something now we call the Economic Freedom Audit, where we'll work with the country to see where they're weak in economic freedom, what could be improved, and what role models are available to improve it. We've set up regional networks, not just in Latin America, but in Asia, and we're working on one in Africa. So the work grows, but there will always be this work to do.
Do you get criticism from the countries that get ranked fairly low in your ratings?
Sometimes we get criticisms from people who think their countries are rated too high.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
They don't like to have that much freedom. Is that it?
No, they think their government is more repressive than it actually is. Oh, yeah, sure. And you know, we get all sorts of criticisms about we're measuring the freedom, you know, of the rich and the powerful, but that's not true. We pay very close attention to the rule of law, to the things that protect the poor, and we look very closely at how the least well-off in a society are doing, and they're doing much better in economically free societies.
Should you pay more attention to political freedoms, in particular to democracy, rather than just economic freedom?
Well, economic freedom is important in and of itself, but you're exactly right. It's one of a group of interconnected freedoms. Over the long term, you can't have, in my view, economic freedom without political and social freedom. And in fact, we're now working on a brand new project, so I'm glad you asked the question, trying to develop an integrated index that brings all of those freedoms together. It's not done anywhere else, and I'm glad to say that my friend Ian Vasquez is one of the leaders of that effort.
We are going to pause for a moment at this point. Estamos en la entrevista, estamos conversando con Fred McMahon, vicepresidente del Fraser Institute. Regresamos en un momento más. Fred McMahon, after all of your experience with this index of economic freedom, is it still worth it to fight for freedom?
Oh, sure. Particularly now. The financial crisis is a real challenge. People have to understand its causes, and its causes were not economic freedom. Its causes were self-dealing at the top of financial institutions, government greed, government overspending, and too much concentrated power. So that makes it worthwhile. Also, when you see the improvement in living standards people experience when they're freed to follow their own desires, it's just a remarkable thing.
Fred McMahon, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you very much.
Y a usted, amigo televidente, que hace posible este programa, se lo agradezco también. Eso es todo por hoy, pero no se lo olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.
El PRI ya lo sacó